Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us during the Lytham Partners Fall 2025 Investor Conference. My name is Roger Weiss, and I'm a Vice President here at Lytham. Today, I'll be hosting a Q&A discussion with Jeb Besser, CEO at the company, who also is a money manager and represents Modular Medical's largest shareholder. I should note that MOD trades under the symbol MODD. And with that all said, let's get started. First of all, Jeb, welcome back.
Thanks, Roger. Good to be back.
Good to have you. Let's get started. Just last month, you and your team visited our hometown of Phoenix for the ADCES, or Nurse Diabetes Educator Conference. What was your message to these nurses? How was it received? And what was your takeaway?
So the ADCES is the best trade show in diabetes that no one's ever heard of, and very few people on Wall Street attend, despite the fact that the 3,000 diabetes educators who attend are probably the biggest influencers as far as wearable diabetes technology that there is. And so we had a presence there. I wouldn't say that we had the biggest booth on the floor, but I would say that our booth was probably the best attended of the entire show. And I think that's because the diabetes educators are the tip of the spear as far as trying to educate people and get them to adopt technology. And so they see all the problems that our pivot tubeless pump that we're going to introduce next year is designed to overcome. Too much training time, too much complexity, lousy form factors, not enough insulin in the reservoir, can't remove it, all of these things. And they were, every single educator we met on the floor said, I have patience for your product right now. Now, they're not the same patients that are on insulin. They said, look, the Omnipod's a great product for a certain group of patients, but there's lots of room here for another product in this space, which is not surprising when you think about 80% of the people who should be on pump from a clinical perspective are still not wearing a pump 25 years after introduction. So there was a huge amount of interest, and they were interested in the fact that we were going to be tubeless. They were interested in the 3 ml reservoir. They were interested in the fact that you don't need a controller in order to manage the device, although you can use an app on your phone to control key functions of the device and get a readout on what's happening with it and download the data. They were quite excited about our Level X game that we announced. And let me say a word about this. So the idea here is not, oh, we're trying to use AI or something to replace the clinician. That's ridiculous. The idea here is, can we use technology to allow them to train the users faster and in a way that's more accessible to them, more acceptable, frankly, more fun. When you look around you walk around the floor at a diabetes show, fun is not the first word that comes to mind. And this is designed to be appealing to someone with the technical sophistication to be able to play Candy Crush on their phone. But at the same time, teach them the basics of what's in the device, what's in the box when you open it, how do you fill up the syringe to fill up the device, how do you use the product? And, wouldn't it be great if your first experience with the product was, here's an iPad, or scan this QR code and play this on your phone for 15 minutes in the waiting room, and then come back, and then let's put the device on for real together. And if you can't master that in the first 15 minutes, master is the wrong word, sorry. If you can't get some sense of whether or not this would work for you in the first 15 minutes, it's probably not going to work for you. And we've all saved a lot of time, right? Because you've sort of acted as a base screen that's a much more accurate screen than the usual diabetes educator screen of, let me see your cell phone and see how advanced it is. Because just because you have an advanced cell phone doesn't mean that you're actually sophisticated at using all of its functionality, right? I mean, most people use 1% of the functionality of Excel or Outlook, as an example. So that's one purpose of the Level X game. Another purpose is, can we cut the training time down for the diabetes educator safely and still allow good proficiency by adding some technology where they can be supervisory for part of the training time and not actively touching the patient and doing all the talking. And, and you always run the risk that someone hasn't had their second cup of coffee and forgets half the stuff they're supposed to say on the first go round. And then when you're doing level 2 support, because the patient doesn't understand some things, you have to go back and start at the beginning. If the first 15 to 20 minutes of your experience with our product is the pivot training game, you know what that experience is going to be like. And so there was a lot of interest in that. And then we had a product theater on Friday evening off the floor. So most of our competitors, well-heeled, larger competitors, had a product theater on the floor where they had, I don't know, like 10, 15 people sitting in folding chairs for 20 minutes listening to hey, here's a demonstration of our product. Very easy to access. I'd say, nominal kind of engagement. I have to confess, I was a little nervous because we had a 300-person ballroom. It was not on the floor. It was about 3 football fields away, and you had to go out, up an escalator, walk, the length of a football field, go down an escalator and go through some double doors and take a right. And that wasn't and it was at the end of a long day. It would have been very easy for the diabetes educators to just go back to the hotel. A shocking number of them drive to this conference, so it's sort of like a affordable vacation type setup as well. And so it would have been very easy for them to, at 5:30, be at the hotel bar and not at our product theater. And so they closed all the doors at 5. We walked and we had the whole thing set up, and you have no idea who's outside. They opened up the doors and there were 150 people there in line waiting to come in and hear our pitch on why you should, on where the pivot fits in with your patients. And then we started 20 minutes late because another 70 people showed up who needed seats too that we had to process. So I'd say to answer your question simply, it was a huge success. It completely validated our opinion that there's a big opportunity for our product. It's not the same as the other products. And I think, in order to enter this space successfully right now, you can either enter the most crowded part of the space and try and out-feature incumbents who have been there for, 15 to 20 years and convince patients who have already learned someone else's interface that, hey, you should forget all that and switch to mine because it's marginally better in some way. Or you can go after the 80% open field that it hasn't adopted technology yet and needs better care.
Got it. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Since we're already talking about the pivot, your tubeless patch pump product, could you discuss the changes that have been made from the current Mod 1 product to the pivot? And if I can say, and I'm sure no one said this, why pivot to the pivot now? And how are these changes being received by both the folks on the clinician side and on the market side?
Okay. So let's go back to the beginning. Our plan was always to get rid of the tube. Always. We always wanted to make this a tubeless patch pump. We thought that by adding the tube with a set that had been used on a Distotronics pump back in 2010, 2011, we would eliminate some FDA risk, get a product through the FDA, and make sure that they had blessed our novel pumping mechanism and our 2-part pump assembled by the user, which had never been done before. And having proven that, we thought, okay, well, let's commercialize the Mod 1 for a period of time while we develop Pivot. When we did our market survey of clinicians and patients in January, the feedback was universal that, look, I get why you did the tube. That's okay. But I really, really want to be able to just go to my patients and say, it's an Omnipod, but it doesn't require a phone. It's 3 mLs. It's removable. And it's much easier to learn and less full featured. And, at some point you have to give people what they want. And that dovetailed very nicely with 2 other factors. One is that the tubed version costs 75% more for us to bring in at scale than a tubeless version. And 2, there's a worldwide shortage of infusion sets of this type and other types too, actually, that meant that we couldn't guarantee if we launched the product that we could supply enough to bring our customer base on. What's worse than not being able to launch a product? Launching a product and then having to take people off it because you can't make product to sell them. So we decided to put all our resources into moving to a tubeless pivot version, the tubeless version, which we call Pivot. And we are on track to file that with the FDA in October per our press release last week and one the week before. So now, when I say FDA again, usually people start to get a little pale in the face and say, "Oh my God, what kind of risks are you taking here?" And nothing. Look, I don't want to candy coat it. Nothing with the FDA is riskless. But when you think about the risks, let's compare the two products because we're going to a special 510(k) where we're asking the FDA, is this product, the Pivot, equivalent to or better than the product that you cleared on September 4th of 2024? So let's look at the differences. So remember, this is our pump. This is the top piece. This is the reusable piece that lasts 90 days. It'll be 180 days next year with no changes. We just have to do more testing on it. This piece is identical. When we announced that the controller line for Mod 1 or the pump line for Mod 1 is ready for human use, the only thing we have to do Pivot with it, besides get the FDA clearance, is to swap out the paperwork and use a different set of serial numbers. So this is highly de-risked because it's the same thing. There is no difference at all. None. Okay, so that's one piece. Now let's go to the consumable. So this is the consumable for the Mod 1. So you can see it's got the coin cell battery, it's got the 12 plastic pieces, and then it's got the little pigtail coming off the side. And on the bottom, I don't know if the viewers can see it here, but there's a little port that goes off to the side that's part of the plastic of the bottom, okay? And that's what you glue this into. Okay. This is a Pivot cartridge. It is identical in every way, except for this bottom piece, where the place where you glue it in instead is a port that faces downwards. So you're changing one molded plastic piece on the consumable. You're changing no pieces on this, and then you're making an adhesive pad package that looks like this, which is the pad that you use an inserter on your arm or on your abdomen to put the patch on, which also inserts the needle. You then remove the needle and you leaves a soft cannula, and then you click it into that device, or you click it into that pad. So this is the adhesive pad it's the same adhesive pad as we had before, materials-wise, except it's got a soft cannula built into it and a removable needle. So that's all. This is also like adhesive pad 101. We use a 3M pad that's used in where the materials are used in lots of other wearable medical applications, et cetera. So I don't want to say it's a slam dunk, but if you think about the risk profile here, we're adding no new materials. The volume of the application is about 10 to 15% of the volume of what we did last year. Most of the tests are pass, fail, yes, no, kind of tests. And that's not to say they're easy, but that's to say we passed them last year, and what's changed that's going to derail us, right? Like, why would we fail biocompatibility now if we haven't added new materials? Why would we fail insulin stability now if the pumping mechanism is the same as we used last year? Why would usability be worse when every study we do with this product says this is easier to put on than the other one? And I think that's reflected in the fact that, we guided in July, and apparently based on the trading volume in the last 2 weeks, no one believed us, that we would be filing this thing in the fourth quarter. And, an FDA submission is not the kind of thing where you get the last set of data in and you hit copy paste from the Excel spreadsheet that the data is in, and you drop it into the FDA form, and then you hit send 5 minutes later. You have to reformat, you have to scrub data, you have to look at things carefully. So if somebody assumes, based on our guidance right now, that we're fairly confident because most of the tests must have already been done, they'd be right. So, from a risk perspective, does that mean there is no risk? No, once again, there's never no risk until it actually happens. But in terms of substantive things that could go wrong at this point, that would derail us from filing on time and getting us in front of the FDA, there aren't very many. And if they do in fact accept it as a special 510(k), where it's is this equivalent or better than, yes, no, it's a yes, no question with a single reviewer. They are on a 30-day clock to get back to us with questions. So if we file in sometime in October, we should get an answer back sometime in November. And if we go interactive and the questions aren't too severe, I don't think it's not impossible that we could be cleared by year end.
Okay.
I mean, our expectation is Q1, but it's not impossible.
Very good.
And because we shut down the Mod 1 production August 22nd and started converting the line over to pivot production already. So we think that we're going to be roughly in line, and there's no way to tell until if we knew exactly when the FDA would clear us, I could tell you exactly. But we believe that we will have the pivot line ready for human use, ready to produce, ready to serve up to 6,000 concurrent patients right when the FDA clears this.
Right. And again, when you talk about the validation and the switch over to the pivot, really what you're talking about is the pivot cartridge, since there's no change whatsoever to the pumping mechanism.
You're absolutely right. Now, the release that you haven't seen yet is the one where we say that the Mod 1 controller or pump is clear, is ready for human use on that line. But as soon as you see that, you'll know that that is true.
Okay. Fair enough. And while we're on this regulatory discussion, just to be clear, where do you sit on the European side of the world? I know we haven't talked about that much, but clearly you're also going for clearance for the EU. So where does that sit from a timing standpoint?
So in Q1, you saw that we announced that we had hired BSI, British Scientific, to manage our CE submission, because the CE process works quite differently than in the US FDA process. You hire the trusted entity who then evaluates you and then issues you the CE mark, and goes to the regulators and said, we did all the stuff we were supposed to do and we looked at it and it's fine. So we've hired the body. They've started to do their work. I would just say stay tuned. Stay tuned for an update on where we stand on that. But our expectation is that we will be cleared in Europe and other territories in the world, select territories that we think are appealing next year.
Okay, fair enough. In discussing back to the US, the Pivot Special 510(k) submission timeline, how does that tie into the commercialization strategy and more importantly, I guess, the potential conversations you're having with folks on the strategic side of the world?
Well, I'll put it this way. Clearly, getting Pivot cleared, getting a true tubeless pump cleared and in a form factor that you can prove that you can produce is a key differentiator. We would be the only cleared tubeless pump, patch pump on the market besides insulin. And, our market cap is under 50 million. Theirs is a hair short of 26 billion. So perhaps there'll be a little bit of, maybe there'd be a little bit of convergence, and hopefully in their direction and not in ours, upon us getting cleared, which would, allow us to have some of those conversations. But it's a very important checkbox. It's one thing for me to hand wave and say, we're going to get this thing submitted and we're going to get it cleared. It's another thing to actually have the letter in hand. And so is that the key differentiator? I think it's key in terms of having those conversations. Does that mean that the goalposts might not move again? Of course it doesn't, right? We're talking, there needs to be competitive tension. And I think our plan initially when we get cleared, remember, we can only serve, the initial production line can serve 6,000 concurrent customers. In a universe of customers that is this big, it does not make sense to launch it everywhere all at once. And the product appeals to different segments of the population at different rates. So for instance, this, Roger, I used to live in downtown Boston, less than a mile from Mass General Hospital. That's not the first place that I would launch the Pivot. It's just you've got a lot of very well insured, hyper educated type A's floating around who will, compete with each other to get the best possible care. I think we want to look at markets that prove that the almost pumpers opportunity is very real and actually accessible, given that and that the problem has not been I won't wear a pump under any circumstances. It's that I won't wear that kind of pump. So I think we would launch in 3 or 4 MSAs to prove that we can get traction with almost pumpers, the pump naive or the pump people have churned off using pumps because they don't feel like doing the work, or they don't see the value proposition. So that's what we'll do. Don't think of this as, and then we get cleared and then we raise enough money to hire 200 salespeople, because that is not, we couldn't supply that kind of demand, and that is not the best way to showcase our product. We want to showcase that we're a particular kind of product for a particular kind of person initially. And I always have to add this because people sometimes forget. There is nothing about our product that is less accurate, that is less safe, that is less. We can, and from a mechanical perspective and a processing power and a communications perspective, we are just as good, if not better, than every other pump on the market. We choose to make the feature set less. We choose to make this a quicker pump to learn, to serve a different audience that is not catered to by the current pumps. That doesn't mean that someone else couldn't partner with us in some way and say, all right, I've got the brand name, I've got 200 salespeople, I've got an AI, I've got an automated insulin delivery system, I can drop that onto your processor and go back to the FDA with it. And in 6 months from now, I could be going head to head with insulin.
Right. But again, from your commercialization strategy, you're not going to be fighting the big boys or the folks
No, we
out
don't.
there.
We
You're
don't.
going,
That's why. Yes, yes.
you're
We
trying
don't
to
want to
steal
go there.
people using needles and basically
Yes,
steal that
yes,
market share.
yes. We don't want to go there. We think that there's plenty of room to go after the 80% that aren't using pump right now versus trying to convert people who have already chosen a pump and trying to convince them to use ours instead.
Right. By the way,
Absolutely.
you did mention sales forces, and we have heard out there that folks like Beta Bionics and Dean Kamen's DECA have been stealing other people's sales people kind of at will. I kind of asked the question a different way. When there's such a great demand for experienced salespeople, will the pivot need a huge sales force? And how do you compete in that world, you know, against whether it's Beta or DECA or Insulet, MiniMed, et cetera?
Okay, well, it's a great question, and I think what you're alluding to is the comments that Tandem made on their own call about, well, we have these irrational competitors right now who are driving up the cost of our salespeople, taking our salespeople, and just generally creating chaos in the market. And this is why you don't want to be in that 20% of that market, right? The 20% of the market that's very competitive right now, because there's a lot of noise, a lot of confusion, a lot of people running around doctors' offices, and you've got new companies that have no near-term incentive to be profitable. And then you have incumbents who are measured on profitability, who are going to really struggle because, why? It's really hard to compete with someone who doesn't have a profit motive in the near term and who has a similar form factor to yours. Like the Beta Bionics iLet is a tubed pump. It is. It's a tubed pump. It's very much like a Medtronic MiniMed, except for the way the algo works, and it has a touchscreen. That's the difference. So yes, we would not want to be in that space. And I think as far as our own salespeople, I think we need a very, very small sales core that goes into the endos offices who already prescribe pumps and say, what about the customers that reject all of these? Do you have a few people like that you think this pump might be appropriate for? And that's what we heard at ADCS over and over again from these high volume prescribers is, of course, I have people like that. There are definitely people who I'd like to put on a pump like that. But then we think our major market is the primary care physicians. Primary care physicians who are the front line, who still see well over 30% of the people who are multiple daily injectors and almost never see a pump salesperson and are afraid to touch the current products. If we could access them, and then that would be a very good market, and a market where there wouldn't be a lot of competition. And we probably want to reach those people through distributors and distributor sales forces, because you might find a primary care physician who has one patient for us, and you might find one who has 50. And it's not efficient necessarily to go to each of those people by yourself, right? You want to come in and be second level support when a distributor identifies, I think this is a good practice for us to send someone in for. So we think much smaller, much more scalable sales force. And remember, our whole thrust with the Level X game and the lesser number of features is right now the clinician Right now, one of the reasons that the current pump companies don't make money or don't make much money at all is that they have this really non-scalable business where you sell one-to-one to the individual patient, and then you train one-to-one to the individual patient because the reimbursement is inadequate for the clinician to do the training. So it gets pushed off on the manufacturers. So you call and say, can you send your trainer in next Tuesday? And they're going to train like the 2 or 3 new pump patients that I've got. And that's a lot of work. What if you could do it yourself and actually get reimbursed? And if the Level X game allows us to do that in an efficient fashion, you'd much rather get $50 for 20 minutes of work yourself instead of, I think, for a lot of people, instead of scheduling, having someone else come into the office, risk your patient who's going to complain to you having a bad experience and or being overburdened by something that they're just not up for. So I think once again, we want to go into areas where it's the right mix of patients and the right kind of practices that are going to be receptive to our message, not totally underinsured, not not completely averse to technology because we want to see like reasonable CGM penetration rates, not because ours needs to work with a CGM, but because that at least shows some willingness to adopt technology. But we want to see a lot of patients who are still at their PCP.
Got it. Um, you recently announced the repricing and conversion of some existing warrants. How does your capital position look, and how do you think about your cash runway into 26 and hopefully an approved pivot?
So when we think about our cash runway, obviously, if you watch enough of my interviews, you'll hear me, wistfully complain about how my cost of capital is 10x that of my competitors. If you look at Beta and Insulet, it's actually very consistent. They're valued at about $50,000 a pump customer. And that's great. We would happily take on that same valuation as we start adding customers. But right now, I think that we're in for a major revaluation in the public markets once we get pivot cleared. So we want to be very judicious about extending our cash runway to getting pivot cleared. And so when I looked at our cap structure, I said, okay, we have these roughly 10 million warrants. There are 5-year warrants that are struck at a little bit more than $1. I view those as virtual shares anyway, because if we can't make someone money at a little more than $1 in 5 years, what am I even doing here as a shareholder and as a CEO? So I'd rather have some of that cash now than all that cash in 5 years or it's sometime before 5 years when, frankly, we will have already long since succeeded or failed. So we went to our existing holders and said, if you exercise any or all of these warrants, for every 2 warrants you exercise, you get a new warrant at 84 cents, and your new exercise price is 10% below the closing price on a particular date. That date was Friday the 21st, and we raised a little bit less than $4 million through this. So once again, it's not the whole solution, but in terms of relative dilution, in terms of putting shares in the right hands, et cetera, I think it was the right thing to do. And another way to reward and allow our existing holders to average down if they wanted to.
Got it. And just to be clear, this doesn't take care of all your capital needs for 2026, but it gets you to a spot where, you can, both have a cleared product and conversations if need be.
Yeah, it gets us certainly through submission, certainly through initial FDA feedback, and then depending on what that feedback is, it could potentially get us through clearance.
Got it. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Are there any other points we should be touching on?
No, I don't think so. This is still a great opportunity. We've tried to keep the cap structure as clean as we possibly can, and we think there's great value to this asset, whether or not it's in our hands or someone else's. And so we're not afraid to execute on this commercially, and we're not afraid if there's a better place for it is somewhere else that we're not afraid to monetize it either. So nothing has changed in our attitude, and we continue to believe that we'll be submitting pivot in October.
Excellent. Well, since obviously October is soon upon us, uh, you know,
Good point. Good point.
uh, well, why don't we wrap up here? Firstly, Jeb, thank you again for joining us at the Lytham Partners Spring 2025 conference, and of course, a big thank you for all the folks out there who are watching. If you have any questions or would like to schedule a meeting with Mod, please send me an email at weiss@lythampartners.com. If you'd like to learn more about Lytham Partners, you can certainly visit our website at lythampartners.com or follow us on LinkedIn to stay connected about future events. We hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference and have a great day.